Welcome, everyone. The webinar will begin shortly. First, I wanted to invite you to connect with our What's Working exchange. We're gathering information about a few strategies related to learning loss recovery. Alrighty, we invite you to connect with us on social media. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR. On Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. And on LinkedIn, subscribe to us at Campaign for GLR. Please use hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything you learn from today's webinar, and we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. The webinar will begin shortly. It will be recorded and shared with you afterwards. Alrighty, hi again, everyone. My name is Sierra Sanchez, and I'll be behind the scenes helping to produce this webinar. I just have a few housekeeping details before we get started. First, we'd love for you to introduce yourself, so please use the chat box at the bottom of the screen to share your name, city or state, and your organization. Be sure when responding to select both panelists and attendees so that we all know who is here. The webinar is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. A link to the recording, as well as any resources and slides shared during the conversation, will be sent in a follow-up email to all who registered. We'll also be posting a brief on-screen evaluation during closing and highly encourage you to respond. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. Oh, and apologies. We also invite you to post any questions you might have in our Q&A box, as we'll be dedicating some time towards the end of the conversation to respond to those questions. I also wanted to turn your attention to some of our upcoming webinars that we have. Later this afternoon at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, we have a session on building parent-centered ecosystems for out-of-school learning. Next week on April 25th, we have a session, a partners webinar, focused on the Community Engagement Initiative, a family engagement framework for sustainable systemic change. Then we hope that you'll join us to kick off the month of May with a 12:30 Funder to Funder workshop co-sponsored by the Patterson Foundation, followed by a 3 p.m. session on making learning happens everywhere a community-wide priority. Registration and information for these sessions will be posted in the chat box now, and we hope you can join us. And finally, for those of you who might have joined late, again, we are gathering information about a few strategies related to learning loss recovery through our What's Working exchange form. The form is quick and easy to complete, and this information will help all of us understand what's happening in our communities and support engagement that will unfold later this year. This survey is short. It takes about 5 to 8 minutes to complete, and we hope you'll go ahead and do so. The link will be posted in the chat box now, and we invite you to pull open that tab and complete it as soon as the webinar ends. Thank you in advance. And joining you now is Sarah Torian, Senior Consultant with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Sierra, and welcome everyone. We're so glad that you could all join us for today's conversation as we continue our focus on the kindergarten year as a critical inflection point in a child's educational progression. The Campaign for Grade Level Reading has been delighted to work in close partnership with New America and the U.S. Department of Education in lifting up the kindergarten year and advancing efforts to ensure that we use evidence-based practices rooted in what the research says about how young children learn best, so that the kindergarten year can function as that sturdy bridge between the early years and the early grades. Over the past 6 months, we have hosted 5 sessions in partnership with New America, exploring evidence-based strategies for supporting literacy, math, and social emotional development in kindergarten, featuring researchers, practitioners, and innovators who have shared their expertise with us. Today, we will continue that conversation, but this time with a focus on the roles that philanthropy can play to strengthen and better align systems, policies, and practices across the birth through 3rd grade continuum with a focus on that critical year of kindergarten. And to begin that conversation, I'm honored to welcome and introduce Laura Bornfriend, who has been our close thought partner throughout this series and is joining us again to moderate today's conversation. Laura is a senior fellow and advisor on early and elementary education with the Education Policy Program at New America, where she focuses on transforming kindergarten and promoting policy and practice that will strengthen the transition into kindergarten and the early grades of elementary school. She's been such an incredible leader and partner throughout this webinar series, and we are absolutely delighted to have her join us again to moderate this conversation focused on the roles that philanthropy can play. Laura?
Thanks so much, Sarah, and thanks to the Campaign for Grade Level Reading and to all of you for joining today. As Sarah mentioned, this webinar is part of a larger series that started back in October on promoting impactful teaching and learning in kindergarten to ensure it's a sturdy bridge connecting pre-K and the early grades. Over the course of this webinar series, we've explored research on building children's executive function and readying children's brains for reading. We've heard from experts about the teaching approaches that foster deep learning for kindergartners. We've heard from district and state officials and educators about how they are working to promote and support playful learning and teaching practices that best meet the learning needs of young students. And we've also heard from experts and researchers about several other areas that are so important for creating well-rounded, joyful, and engaging learning experiences for kindergartners and other early learners, including more challenging math, science, and the power of learning in outdoor environments. So today we're excited to jump into the conversation with funders about how they are supporting children's early learning, pre-K third. But first, we have the opportunity and really pleasure to hear from Swati Adarkar, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy and Early Learning at the U.S. Department of Education. Swati currently serves in that role. She brings extensive expertise in early childhood policy. She was previously a co-founder and president and CEO of the Children's Institute, a statewide childhood policy and advocacy organization in Oregon. And she's also served on advisory committees and early childhood for 3 Oregon governors, among other roles. So Swati, we're happy to have you with us here today. And I can you help us to really set the table for today's conversation about the important role of funders in transforming kindergarten by just providing us some background on, the Department of Ed's emerging pre-K third agenda.
I would be happy to do so, Laura. Thank you so much for that warm welcome and the partnership with New America and the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today and to provide an update on the Department of Education's preschool through 3rd grade early learning agenda. I joined the department almost 11 months ago and have had the opportunity to learn a lot about how we support state education agencies and local school districts with a special focus on populations such as dual language learners, kids with delays, learning differences, disabilities, and low-income students, and other special populations that the department pays close attention to. As the legendary Barbara Bowman has reminded us on many occasions, the developmental span of early childhood begins at birth and goes through 3rd grade, through those early elementary years. And that is why we collaborate so closely with our sister agency, Health and Human Services, on early learning and development, particularly during the birth to 5 years. Many of you will be familiar with the federal preschool development grants. That's an example, as well as serving children with delays, learning differences, and disabilities. The Department of Education's leadership role and opportunity for early learning is really in the elementary years, from preschool through 3rd grade. I was really delighted to be in the audience when Secretary Cardona offered remarks to launch the department's Raise the Bar initiative in January and supported the president's call for universal early education. Secretary Cardona encouraged us to begin by expanding preschool with Title I funds and enhancing kindergarten as a sturdy bridge to the early grades. In December 2021, well before I arrived at the department, the Secretary announced a commitment to the kindergarten year becoming a more effective path to early school success and academic recovery through a kindergarten collaborative. My longtime mentor, Dr. Ruby Takanishi, the founder of the Pre-K Third movement, said we have to do a better job of reducing the chaos at the schoolhouse door. By this, she meant we need to build a more aligned system, a system that requires a sturdy bridge between the early years and early grades. This bridge is kindergarten. The initial phase of the department's Pre-K Third agenda is kindergarten centered and acknowledges the need to leverage existing resources. The 2022 Nations Report Card leaves no doubt that more children now, unfortunately, are on the wrong side of a much wider gap. We've got to start early with both reading and math, and we have to align what happens at home with what happens in the classroom. As has been said earlier, Sarah mentioned kindergarten is an inflection point. Data has pointed to the widening gap during the kindergarten year. It presents a unique opportunity to accelerate early learning, equity, and lay the path for early school success by meeting the developmental needs of every entering kindergartner. Kindergarten is often our first at-scale early learning opportunity. That's why the continuing chronic absence rates in kindergarten is so troubling. I really appreciate Attendance Works drawing our attention to this critical issue. The kindergarten year is a time to build and nurture adult relationships, essential to ongoing family engagement and building those everyday routines, such as daily attendance. We have an opportunity to equip kindergarten teachers with the tools and the information they need to meet students where they are and to do so at the beginning of their educational journey. Driving towards a more robust, effective, and equitable kindergarten is going to require us to take up three tough and complicated challenges. The first, we've got to transform those two critical transitions, the transition into kindergarten and the transition from kindergarten to first grade, so that we can inform developmentally appropriate practice in kindergarten and differentiated instruction in the early grades. As we elevate the need for developmentally appropriate practice, we've also got to make sure that we bring an equity lens that attends to the unique developmental needs of individual children. And thirdly, we've got to hone in on the enabling conditions for success. These include intentional and systematic alignment for continuity, powerful models of instructional and assessment practice, professional development and supports, productive partnerships with parents, caregivers, and families, interagency, cross-sector, and community-wide collaboration, and the all-important blending and braiding of funding to facilitate alignment, collaboration, and equity. Many of you will recognize these as the key levers for system reform that have been at the center of so many philanthropic efforts. We're looking forward to working with you and learning from you. And we also look forward to hearing from you as we launch a Bright Spots campaign to lift up promising practices, proof points, and sources of inspiration to inform our work. Thank you so much. I look forward to the discussion and conversation today.
Excuse me. Thank you so much, Swati. And I just want to offer to everyone on today that if you have questions, let me just give you we've got a couple of minutes to answer those that we have with Swati. And so while everyone's putting that in the chat, I just want to, Swati, I have a question for you. You know, one of the challenges for a lot of states and districts is really breaking down silos across the traditional, you know, K-12 and early care and education space. And I know that's something that you've been working to do both within the Department of Ed and, you know, with other agencies. Can you talk just a little bit about what's been important in doing that work at the federal level?
Absolutely. I think this notion of cross-agency work is really critical. And I think we got some really important groundwork that was laid during the Obama administration across this, birth to 8 spectrum, because there's so many facets of a child's development, and it doesn't sit just at the federal level. It's, the federal, state, and local level, and working with families, parents, and community partners. And so I think the challenge for us is how to really center the needs of children and families and have us ensure we're wrapping around with the different funding streams and making them work together. But it's been a real pleasure to work with my counterpart at HHS, Katie Ham, and we're doing a lot of work to bring both political appointees and career staff together to really delve into this cross-agency work and sort of shine the spotlight on the need to build these sturdy bridges.
Great, thanks for that, Swati. And I see some comments of congratulations for your work thus far in the chat. Oh, and we have a couple of questions coming in. So this is from Satoya Williams. How do you see the role of pre-K partnerships within the scope of the pre-K third agenda?
Thank you so much for that question. Preschool, it's so exciting to see preschool expanding through partnerships and funding at the federal, state, and local level. We really embrace a mixed delivery system and think it's really important that parents are able to choose the best placement for their children. And so schools are just one of those settings, but we know that childcare, Head Start, state-based preschool, these are all important parts of the delivery system. And so you have to have partnerships to make this work, whether it's funding or the workforce. I think one of the challenges is how we provide the necessary training and professional development when early educators are in so many different settings that are really different contexts. And so I think one of the things we need to think about is how we really get the right supports and information to educators so that they can really inform their practices. The HHS, Health and Human Services, has a real focus right now on workforce, and they're doing a lot through the Preschool Development Grant, and we're partnering with them on that.
Yeah, great. Okay, we have another question. How do we encourage state education departments to utilize their already created kindergarten assessments for school district? And this person just says, we have one in Pennsylvania that's optional for school districts. Some use it, but others don't. And it creates difficulty in knowing a data point of how many kindergartners are kindergarten ready and creating the necessary solutions to increase that data point.
Thanks so much for that question. It feels like this is a whole topic unto itself, and I don't want to give it short shrift, but I think one of the challenges we've had, there was this sort of emergent phase where states were developing different approaches to how to give information to school systems on, where children are entering kindergarten. I think one of the challenges is there hasn't been an accompanying body of work to really be able to inform parents sort of what are the uses of assessments, how do we engage children, how do we engage families in informing educators, how do we bring all the information to the table. And so, education policy is really determined at the state and local level. So the federal government is playing a different role in, we don't obviously play a role in requiring these assessments. It feels like what's missing in the conversation are the sorts of tools and information that can really inform instruction. Some of the assessments inform state policy. And I know for some, talking to educators, part of what can be really challenging is what are the tools they have that will allow them to really know as each child enters their classroom, how they can best support their unique needs and development. So we're really trying to encourage a conversation that shines the spotlight on really building effective practice. And that's why we're honing in on those enabling conditions of success.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think you raise an important point that particularly at kindergarten, the need to differentiate is so important because children coming in, many have Head Start or pre-K experiences, but many do not. And so it's so important for teachers to have tools to be able to meet the individual needs of children coming in. Thank you again, Swati. We really appreciate you being able to join today and hope that, there might be questions for you later on if you're able to stay with this whole session.
Thanks so much.
You're welcome. And now I'd like to welcome our funder panel. And thank you all for joining today for this important conversation about philanthropy and their role in supporting strong early learning. First, I would like to introduce Chris-Ann Gale. She serves as Chief Strategy and Policy Officer and Co-Director at Trust for Learning, where Chris-Ann guides the organization's grant-making efforts and leads its national policy strategy to accelerate access to ideal learning programs. Welcome, Chris-Ann. We also have with us today Phil Halperin, who serves as president of the Silver Giving Foundation, where he focuses on quality early education, systemic improvements, and enhancing teacher career pathways. Phil also wears another hat, which he brings to this conversation today as the executive director of California Education Partners, where he supports California school districts in identifying and addressing challenges and advancing solutions to support student success. Welcome, Phil. We also have Sarah Slaughter, who serves as the executive director of the W. Clement and Jesse V. Stone Foundation. Sarah oversees investments designed to build equitable systems in K-12 education, early childhood education, and youth development. Welcome, Sarah. And we have with us Brian Stokes. Brian serves as the Education Portfolio Director at the Robert R. McCormick Foundation, where he leads the foundation's investments in programs and initiatives serving families with children birth through kindergarten. Welcome to each of you. And again, thank you for being here and joining this conversation. Before we get into a discussion about what we just heard from Swati from the U.S. Department of Ed, I'd like to give each of you a chance to share just a little bit about the ways in which your organizations are working to support children's early learning and early school success. Can you tell us briefly about your foundation and the approach you are taking to support children's success in the early years and early grades? What piece of the puzzle are you each addressing? So Chris-Ann, let's start with you. And as I understand the Trust for Learning, it's a little bit unique in this group as a coalition of funders. Chris-Ann?
Yes, thank you so much, Laura. And thank you to the Campaign for Grade Level Reading for the invitation to be here today. So the Trust for Learning is a bit unique in this space. We are a philanthropic partnership that is composed of multiple funders. some individual family foundations, other larger philanthropic groups that have united together in an effort to support and strengthen the quality of early learning environments for young children birth to age 8. And we work across all settings where children are during this important developmental continuum, in home-based childcare, community and school-based preschool, Head Start programs, and in the early elementary grades. The transition from preschool to kindergarten is obviously right in the middle of that important period. So we are really excited to be here today and be a part of this discussion. The funding partners that make up Trust for Learning believe that all children should have access to the highest quality programs that are guided by foundational principles that are essential for high quality learning environments. These are the principles of ideal learning, which you can see in your screen. And they include and start really with a commitment to equity-based decision-making. They include fundamental tenets about how children learn, such as through constructing knowledge, through their diverse experiences, through play, through relationships. They stress the importance of a personalized learning approach and also a well-prepared learning environment that encourages exploration and curiosity. And the role, of course, as a teacher, as a facilitator and guide. And they also include a commitment to continuous adult learning and development. The next slide depicts how we work at Trust for Learning. Our work really centers around strengthening both the early learning environment and the policy environment that support children and families at the center. And we do this primarily through 3 strategies: direct investments or grant making, thought partnership, and also movement building. These are the strategies really that we believe need to work together so that we can affect the change that we would like to see in the field. And all of our work, of course, is grounded in a fundamental, strong commitment to racial equity and inclusion and to those principles of ideal learning that I mentioned before. Thank you for the opportunity to share about our organization, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thanks, Chris-Ann. Phil, let's bring you on now. And I know, as I mentioned, you wear 2 hats, both of which relate to today's conversation, but starting with your work at the Silver Giving Foundation, and then we'll dig in later to your work with California Education Partners. So tell us about your foundation and your work there.
Thanks a lot, Laura. So at Silver Giving, we're based in California. 80% of our grant making is actually focused on the P3 space alone, with a particular focus on emerging bilingual kids in the state of California. 60% of our children come from homes where the language primarily spoken is not English. And so it's an important dynamic that we are dealing with, and it's an opportunity in the state of California as well. We're basically committed to finishing the last mile of what Swati outlined. We look at our role from being from the state house all the way down to the schoolhouse and the classroom. And we have a very sophisticated grant strategy. We invest in people and stuff. And so on the people side, given the dynamic in California, you need a very diverse and racially, both and linguistically, workforce over the long haul. So we work very closely with all the teacher prep programs in the state of California and supporting them thinking through this new P3 lens. And we support state visioning around what the workforce needs to look like and be able to do. We build cross-sector networks to enable this. And then for us, it's a lot about strengthening the early pathways for teaching. On the stuff side, like similar to what Swati was talking about, we think a lot about system capacity building and equality, alignment, and coherence, particularly for our multi-language learner kids. If they go through a system where it's incoherent and it's not quality, they're going to be the ones who are challenged the most by the system. So improving capacity of state state actors, school district actors to provide quality and coherent instruction is really what our STUFF strategy is all about. And then lastly, sort of supporting both of those things, we work around enabling conditions. So looking at closely at research on effective practices, we do a lot of advocacy work, external pressuring to improve policy, goal setting, and implementation, as well as supporting the narrative change. The narrative change in California is a particular dynamic, given that for 20 years, it was basically illegal in the state of California to offer effective instruction to our bilingual youngsters. That has had lasting damage. That got turned around, but the system to support them has not followed suit so as quickly as it needed to be. So that's where we spend a lot of our time as well. So that's what we're up to.
Thanks, Phil. Sarah, will you talk about the Stone Foundation and your work there?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you to the Campaign for Grade Level Reading for doing this today. And thank you for Swati for not only today, but for her leadership on this. And when I was looking at the attendees list, I was so excited to see not only the geographic diversity, but the diversity in organizations and interest areas that folks are from, whether it was literacy, wellness, SEL, science, which is often not thought of as part of P3, but we know it is. And so I'm really heartened by this. And you know, when Swati talked about the home classroom connection, that really we have the power of those who are on this call to really sort of help make that connection. So the Stone Foundation is primarily a systems and policy funder. We fund an awful lot in the early childhood side. We fund an awful lot of both state and national advocates who are working to build the system and get investments in the system. And we really focus a lot on the workforce. And we do that because it's certainly our belief that the workforce is really sort of the theory of change, if you will, meaning that especially for our youngest students, it's that quality of adult interactions that has the greatest impact on their wellness and their outcomes. So focusing an awful lot on that, and which of course also has tremendous equity implications because of the many women of color who are in this field. Specifically on the K-12 side, we have been focusing a lot on principals and leaders. And again, the reason behind that is while our research is a little dated, I still don't think it's changed that much, that when you look at principals, superintendents, district chiefs, etc., for the most part, they did not come from an early childhood or P3 experience, nor do most of the leadership preparation programs have that embedded. So we've been working a lot on that in Illinois, but also nationally, of how do you support that embedding of early childhood, as well as dual language learners, special ed, and social emotional learning into our principal and leader preparation programs. So they're prepared to lead systems that incorporate those values that we all hold near and dear. So that's a little bit of what we fund, Laura.
Thank you, Sarah. And Brian, so what is McCormick investing in that's related to this early years and early grade continuum?
Sure. Thanks, Laura. It's great to be here, and thanks so much to the Campaign for Grade Level Reading for having me. I think I can say ditto to a lot of what Sarah said, since we, our foundations work together so closely, especially around systems. So, McCormick, our education giving is focused really on birth through kindergarten. So this is a great conversation. So we are really thinking about that transition and how we can strengthen and enhance the kindergarten experience. Our work is focused sort of citywide in Chicago and some work statewide, but we really think about how can we ensure that all children in Chicago have access to quality early education programs, in those birth through K years. And they're not only starting kindergarten ready to thrive in school, which is often our metric is like kindergarten readiness we think about in early ed, but how can we also make sure they're transitioning into school environments designed around their success? And so our investments, we sort of invest, I'd say, in 4 areas. So equipping educators, thinking about sort of the child at the center. How do we equip educators? How do we support families and communities that those children are living in? How do we strengthen the leaders? So, to Sarah's point, that so many of our leaders in schools don't necessarily come from an early ed background. They're coming from like a high school calculus teacher background. So they get to an elementary school that now is starting at pre-K, and there's a weird shadowy hallway where there's like young kids running around. They don't really know what's going on. So how do we address and support their needs? And then systems. How do we support strengthening and promoting cohesive and sustainable systems, both in the early education space, where we have a very fragmented system of funding and governance, but then that connection over to K-12, ensuring that it's not, I like this sturdy bridge idea of it's not, 2 castles with a moat in the middle, but really building a bridge between the early ed system and our K-12 system. So a few things that we've invested in recently that I think are relevant. We recently invested in an organization locally called VOCEL that does some work in schools across Chicago. And what we were excited about there is their targets are leaders, families, and educators. They've got separate programs for each. So what if we layer those supports within a single school? What could the impact be? What could the, not only the impact on pre-K learners, but sort of the spillover impact on the whole building? And we've also invested pretty heavily as a foundation, as I know, Sarah and Stone have as well, and other foundations locally, in our state's establishment of a kindergarten readiness assessment. I saw in the, a few comments in the chat about states that have begun to, do that work or where it's optional. Illinois has actually, made substantial progress towards it being universal, being a required assessment in statute. It's called KIDS. I think it's on my list, hopefully, of links I sent in advance. But so we've gotten to the point now that every kindergarten teacher is implementing this assessment. But because of the way we've siloed early ed, this assessment that's observation-based, developmentally appropriate, doesn't look like what kindergarten looks like in much of the state. So we have a lot of work now to do, and we're starting to think about how we can support that work to make sure that our assessment tool that really is built on child development is a driver of developmentally appropriate practice in K.
Thanks, Brian. And that assessment piece is so important. And I know just from what you said, being in classrooms and hearing from teachers that they don't get enough preparation themselves and how to deliver those kinds of assessments, particularly kindergarten teachers when they're observational. But we know this is a totally different conversation related, but we could have a whole session on talking about assessment and preparation. So just given the important investments that you've each just introduced, what are your reflections on what you heard from Swati, and what have you seen emerging from the Department of Ed as part of its pre-K third agenda and its focus on kindergarten as that sturdy bridge? So let's stick with you, Brian, and we'll go in reverse order. So Sarah, you're on deck.
I forgot we were going in reverse order, so I thought, oh, I've got a break now. So I definitely really appreciate Swati and the department thinking about kindergarten as a sturdy bridge. One thing that struck me is Swati, when you said reducing the chaos at the schoolhouse door. We a few years ago in Illinois had a kindergarten transition advisory committee that I had was fortunate to be part of alongside policy leaders in early ed and educators and principals and families. We had families who sort of were on the committee as well as came and testified. And there was one family, I think in the East St. Louis area, who mentioned that when she, after being in a preschool program that was, warm and nurturing and really around family engagement, her experience then bringing her child to the first day of kindergarten was that she wasn't even allowed in the elementary school building. She had to hand her, 5-year-old off to a security guard who then walked the kid back to a kindergarten classroom that, she never got to see. So I really do appreciate that, that intentional thinking about, how do we build this seamless this seamless experience, because we know that, nothing magic happens at age 5. The continuum of development, from birth all the way through to 8, really is a continuum, but our systems don't recognize that. So I really do appreciate that. I think that there are a lot of implications for then what that means in policy and practice. Something that's come up a lot in conversations around the kids tool that I mentioned is we resource pre-K classrooms to be places of play, places of developmentally appropriate practice. We don't resource kindergarten classrooms that way. And so we don't resource kindergarten classrooms to have centers, to have a dramatic play area, to have small group learning. We kind of rely on, the teacher to use whatever they get, which often isn't very much. And so there are some questions of policy, practice, funding, et cetera, I think that are great opportunities since the department has highlighted this. And the only other thing that comes to mind, I think, is, one thing we have been able to do in Illinois is build very intentionally the early grades into principal preparation. So we still have the, high school calc teacher to elementary pipeline, but we have at least ensured that if you're becoming a principal in Illinois, you do receive content, you do receive focused content about those early years. And so I think that's the beginning of starting to change the mindset and change away from belief that, K and up has to be rote learning or teacher directed learning. And so I think this focus on the sturdy bridge can help drive that point home.
Sarah?
Okay. Sure. Well, yeah, we certainly have deep appreciation for both Swati and the department's focus on this. And I believe right before I hopped on this Zoom, I saw something that there was going to be a White House briefing this afternoon about some of the things that they were doing to focus different agencies' attention on the importance of childcare. I think that this P3, and particularly the K3, it's so underattended. It has traditionally been so underattended, and it oftentimes falls between the cracks, right? And Swati gave us all sorts of reasons why we shouldn't, talking about the equity and the good outcomes and all these reasons why it shouldn't fall below the radar. And yet it does. And so I think that, this is a real opportunity for all of us who are on this webinar today to really sort of seize this moment and also think about the fact, I know I saw Hetty Chang and she's far more the expert, but that attendance, which people are going to, K-12 experts pay a lot of attention to when kids get older, that starts in the early years, right? Both a parent's understanding of the importance and, when should I send my kid to school if they have a runny nose, or is it okay if, hey, we just, the weather's not good today, or whatever the reason might be, that those things start early, right? They have their roots in very early years. And then we talk about family engagement. And again, family engagement looks different depending on the size of your kid, right? But schools want parents to show up for parent-teacher conferences, for report card pickup. That's family engagement, right? And so, I think that those things are so important, and that really sort of building out the Department of Education, they're elevating that to K-12 folks is so important. And it will have, I think it can have a real impact on things like kindergarten assessment, principal preparation, attendance, social emotional learning, all those things. And again, I think those of us represented here on the call, but all these things that really sort of come together to really make up the rich P3 years. So great appreciation, and hopefully we can make the most of this at this point in time.
And so how can we better push up some of those strong, good early childhood practices into kindergarten, early grades that can really help build those habits of good attendance and family engagement, which we know is important, all the way up. But it's, as you said, I totally agree, the early years where you build those, the foundation for that. So thanks, Sarah, and Brian and Phil. Now, put both of your hats on, and as you're thinking about, this conversation, and reflect on what Swati said.
So you want me to go now, or is Brian up?
Oh,
okay. Great. So I think we're sharing slides now. Yes, we are. Great. So what we think Swati is a visionary, frankly. So what we do, and now I'm having my California Education Partners executive director hat on. So 50% of our work is focused on districts working on P3 coherence and alignment. This is a big part of what we do. And the reason we got into this work so full throttled was what I call the why, what versus how dynamic. So we've talked on this call a lot about why we do this work, the importance of this work. We've talked about what of the work is, this program or that program and the like. But what is missing so often with our districts is, how do I actually pull it together? How do I pull this principal leadership thing, this new EL curriculum, this teacher workforce preparation piece? How does it all come together? And that, we believe, is the missing link in all of this. Some people refer to this as the last mile, but it's really the implementation side. It's not a lot of fun. It's not very sexy, but it's kind of what we do. Let me talk to you a little bit about where we do this work. So if you'll go to the next slide. If you'll go to, there you go, thank you. If you look at this, we're currently working with 25 school districts around the state of California on coherence and alignment for their early years. We focus on both math and literacy. But if you look at that map, if you're familiar with the state of California, we work in a lot of areas where there are small, often rural districts. They're isolated. There are places where not a lot of service providers tend to go, or improvement partners tend to go. But it's where 48% of the kids in the state of California go to school districts that are smaller than 20,000. And as a policy at the state level, we kind of over-index at the level of like LAUSD or Oakland or San Francisco or San Diego. Policy is not at the state level cognizant of the needs and desires and challenges that these smaller districts face. So that's where we tend to go. There tends to be high levels of poverty in these parts of California, among the highest in the state, actually the entire nation. So what do we do with them? If you'll go to the next slide. We take very much of a systems orientation. We don't pretend to be the smartest bear in the woods, but we are extremely focused. So we focus on 4 critical shifts, systemic shifts with each district in order to tackle this. So it's around having grade level expectations. What do we want kids to know and be able to do? What are the high leverage practices, pedagogical practices? What are the levers we want to pull? And then we've talked a little bit about this call about assessments. So it's one thing to have assessments, which many of our districts don't have, but it's an aligned assessment from pre-K through 3rd grade. And then what do you do with the information? And how does that link back to your pedagogical practice as your vision? And then lastly, but almost most importantly, is like, what is the system? What is the practices? What are the policies you're doing that is improving and building teacher and administrator capacity for the long haul to do this? We work with our districts a minimum of 3 years, so it's a long commitment, but we kind of view it's necessary, and we view we're sad that we haven't fostered a lot of other competitors or other folks doing this, but a guy can hope. So that's what we do at California Education Partners, and we think it's exciting work, and we look forward to working with more and more districts.
Thank you, Phil. Okay, Chris-Ann, let's turn to you, and what were your reflections and thoughts on Swati's comments?
Well, I really thank her for her comments, and excited to hear from the department and to see them really digging in on the alignment between preschool through third grade. When you think about it, that represents about a third of a child's education. And oftentimes, like, it gets really short thrift. So I'm really glad to see the leadership from the department on this. And also, I think too often we divide the early care and education, birth through 5, and elementary school. And that really is, kind of this false dichotomy, because in fact, that whole period is part of a developmental continuum for children's learning and development, which I think both Swati and Laura referred to. So I'm personally excited to hear that the Department of Ed is collaborating and with the Department of Health and Human Services to really strengthen that continuum of learning. Also, I thought that, I think Laura was talking about this earlier, but, this idea that, children come to preschool and to kindergarten from varied experiences. And, they've already had many, many experiences before they even enter kindergarten that help to shape their perception of the world around them, that help to already shape their cognitive, social, and emotional skills. And, kids don't just start learning when they get to kindergarten. So to the extent that the Department of Education can really help to encourage educators and schools and districts to build stronger bridges to these experiences that children have before they come into kindergarten, I think is really, really important. And I think it's also smart to really highlight some of the enabling conditions that will support that sturdy bridge in kindergarten, because there are many people that are working in the philanthropic sector and in other sectors on pieces of that puzzle, whether it be on educator development or aligning curriculum and instruction, or that partnership with families. A number of those enabling conditions that Swati talked about, I think are really important. And I hope to see more from the Department of Ed on, highlighting maybe some of the best practices in those areas, and working with others in the field to really help people on the ground with implementation.
And I know, thank you, Chris-Ann, and I know you're bringing your knowledge and expertise as a former official in the Department of Ed to your, response there. And so that's good and helpful insight. So let's now shift to challenges or, other issues. And so, Sarah, we'll start on this one with you, but really what are some of the just underlying issues that your investments are responding to, including those practice challenges? And, we've all talked about system and policy, those system and policy challenges, and how might the pre-K third agenda and this focus on seamless transitions both in and out of kindergarten be leveraged to help address, mitigate some of those challenges?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great place to spend time and think. And I guess I want to, Chris-Ann, you talked about this false dichotomy, right? And really you made me think about, yes, absolutely. And even extrapolating that, I think that we need to be mindful of many of those false dichotomies and how they impact practice and policy. And particularly the moment that we're in now, right? Whether, I don't know whether it's post-pandemic or whatever we call this time that we're in, we know that we collectively are dealing with an awful lot of trauma, mental health issues, long absences, lost learning time, right? And I think we have to acknowledge that we live in a society that wants to find a silver bullet and a quick fix. And that oftentimes that might lead to, so let's test, let's, give this really rigorous assessment or, rigorous curriculum right now and whatever. And we forget some of the things that I think that we know and value in this P3 world, which is relationships matter, taking the time to connect and understand, taking the time to heal, and that's not a diversion from good outcomes and wellness. That's not a diversion, but rather a pathway to good outcomes and wellness. So I think, you made me really think about that, Christine, when you talked about that false dichotomy. And I think that using sort of our collective voices, we have to really amplify that and support, I think, Swati and the Department of Education in getting that out there. I think, the other thing that occurs to me, and Phil talked a lot about working within districts. And if we think about really P3, that the power analysis, when you think about where the power is, the power does reside within the district, within the K-12 area, in terms of funding streams, hiring, practices, professional development opportunities. And so, it's really smart to really think about that as a lever of change. And yet a lot of us come into this work from the early childhood standpoint. So I think, in terms of our funding, we try to think about how do we build champions on both sides of that bridge, both in the early childhood and K-12 arena, bringing them together so they sort of talk the same talk and realize the same values. And just Brian talked about kindergarten readiness in Illinois. And really, if we go way back to when that was launched, it was launched with a funding process that funded 3 different organizations. One was an early childhood advocacy group, one was a K-12 advocacy group, and one was a higher ed institution that had early childhood roots, Barbara Bowman Erickson Institute. So really, it was a very intentional funding opportunity to bring those different sort of areas together. And then with advisors from early childhood, from schools, et cetera. And I will say that one of the early adapters in one of our school districts is now our state superintendent. So I think that speaks to the power of building champions who are what I call bilingual. They speak early childhood speak and K-12 speak.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Such important points. Brian, same question to you.
Sure. Well, I'll agree with everything Sarah said. So I'm done. No. Yeah, I think that there are a number of challenges that we need to sort of work through and resolve, thinking about how to achieve this kind of desired state of kindergarten to sturdy bridge and this pre-K to 3rd grade alignment approach. I think one is this sort of specter. So Sarah mentioned how siloed we are between sort of the early ed on a policy advocacy level and K-12. And I think that plays out too in communities, especially as think about Chicago. Chicago's made great progress towards building universal pre-K for 4-year-olds in schools. I worked in that when I was at CPS, but it comes with this sort of specter of competition. We have a scarcity mindset of resources, of families. We think that If families aren't enrolling in a certain program, it's because they're being stolen, right? And that's just sort of how our field has grown and evolved. And so I think that prevents a lot of the collaboration and the conversations that need to happen between our community-based early childhood sector and schools, and vice versa. And so I think one way we're trying to help mitigate that is we've invested a lot in Chicago's built an early childhood data system that is sort of in beta now, but we can all look at in common how many families are being served, how many families are not being served, what is the capacity to serve those families in our system, and move from competition to really thinking collaboratively about all of the kids that we have in our system are going to go to kindergarten, most of those in our public schools. How do we make sure we're reaching those families and then providing a smooth handoff? The other, and I think, Chrisanne, you mentioned this sort of idea of push down and sort of like one of the problems we've got is that kindergarten has become the new first grade, and there are people who expect that. One of the things that struck me a lot when I was at CPS, I was there during kind of the beginning of the pandemic. I'm not sure, Sarah, what we're calling this period now, but sort of the dark days. And what struck me was like every day I got an email from some new ed tech company that sprouted up because everybody's got federal money, and they're like, hey, we've reinvented reading for young children since they're learning at home. And then you open it and it's just like, oh, somebody made a crappy children's book in MS Paint and put it in an app. And it's like there are so many of those, and families were being inundated with those too, and being told your kid's falling behind, here's how to help them, you help them learn. And it wasn't about developmentally appropriate practice. It wasn't based in any research that we know and value. So I think like where does I think we've got to figure out in our system, where does this push down affect? Why do we think kindergarten needs to be what first grade used to be? Why do we think that families need to buy flashcards? Why is our sort of society swimming in this idea that young kids are going to be behind and sort of fail in life if we don't like stuff them full of knowledge in a really didactic way? So yeah, not to ramble on, but I think that's another issue we've got to kind of try to solve in some way. And I'll mention one. I know I provided a link to this, but we've got a project we've invested in through Illinois Action for Children called Community Parenting Saturation, that's been trying to help communities address this, especially on the family end, supporting families learning about developmentally appropriate practices and learning about play-based learning, and sort of take an active role in their child's development.
Thanks for that, Brian. Chrisanne, over to you next.
I think I already answered that question. No?
About challenges?
Oh, no, I'm sorry.
No, that's.
I kind of got lost in the questioning there. Sorry about that. No, I think that one of the big challenges that we're seeing, and we're doing some grant making in this area, and we talked about it before, but it is this sort of lack of continuity between the overall learning approach between preschool and kindergarten. I talked before about the principles of ideal learning and those being really grounded in developmental science and best practice on how kids learn and develop. And if we really believe that and want to attend to the way kids learn, we need to be flexible and fluid during those years of preschool through kindergarten. Really encourage kids' interests, their agency, their sense of wonder. It shouldn't be so starkly different between preschool and kindergarten. So in Colorado, in particular, where we've made an investment recently, the state has just adopted universal pre-K there. And we are supporting local providers to help them in establishing and strengthening their learning approach and that continuum between preschool and kindergarten, so that when the public funding starts to kick in and programs are beginning to implement more on the pre-K side in the fall, that there's already strong programming in place for those programs to be connecting with kindergarten around a strong continuum of learning. And we're supporting a number of programs as part of a cohort so that they can really learn from each other, and we can learn from them, and we can really take back some of the best practices in that and share it with others in the philanthropic community as well. Another challenge that I think is really important, which many of my colleagues have already mentioned, is developing and sustaining the workforce in this area. And I won't go into all that we're doing in that area, but just to say that that's another area where we're investing.
Thank you, Chris-Ann. And Phil, I'll turn it over to you to answer the same question about challenges. And if you want to also connect it to the next question, bringing in any work you're doing to kind of think about how to solve these challenges, that would be great. And then we'll go back to you, Sarah, to talk about future work. So Phil, challenges and how you're solving them.
All right. I'll give it a shot, Laura. It's just, for me, it's one word. It's humans, and it's building off what Chris-Ann just said. We don't have enough humans. We don't have the right humans. We don't have. If you think about what the K-12 system is about, it's about the development of human capacity. So it's one set of humans who have capacity, trying to pass that on to another set of humans who have capacity. And right now, we do nowhere close to both the number of people who want to join the early ed workforce, even if they want to be teachers. There is no incentive whatsoever for people to want to join the early ed workforce. They are incentivized to work in the higher grades, often for higher pay, often for higher prestige. So there's no prestige in it. I was heartened in the beginning of COVID, during the first 3 weeks, there was some celebrity saying first grade teachers should be paid $1 million. Where has that modality of thought gone? It's completely dissipated. In the state of California, we are introducing a transitional kindergarten, which I applaud the governor for doing. We are 15,000 teachers short. That's a lot of teachers. That's a lot of teachers. So we need to fundamentally reimagine how we both incentivize, compensate, and support the teachers who want to be in front of our youngest children. I have this dream, Laura, that 10 years from now, I walk into a elementary school anywhere in the state of California and ask, who is your best teacher? And the principal looks at me like I have two heads, because she will say, of course it's my pre-K or K teacher, because that's the most important grade. Right? And by the way, I pay them the most, right? That is not the reality that exists today. So we really need to reimagine how we incentivize these. I mean, it is rocket science. The heterogeneity of the students that are in that classroom is by far the greatest. And so how you pull that off, particularly in the state of California, where 60% of those kids, English is not their primary language at home. Right? So just think about that, and connecting that back to, Laura, to what you were saying vis-a-vis like what our strategy is. We're super boring at the Silver Giving Foundation because we're just going to keep doing more of the same. We're taking a 10-year approach to this P3 challenge, and we are simultaneously eagerly patient with our grant making, because this is going to take a long time. Sustaining this work, we think, is the key. And we do think this is the most vexing issue facing both the state right now. And I don't say this arrogantly, so I apologize if it comes off that way, but as goes California, as goes the nation, right? The nation is becoming much more multilingual, and we need to embrace that as an asset. But that is no more true than in the state of California. And if we can't get that right, that's going to have cascading impacts on the rest of the country. Now, having said that, I would also say that one of my bully pulpits, Laura, is the role of foundations. And I just think that we need to be very risk-oriented. We need to not assure our boards that this grant or that grant is going to work. There's a gentleman by the name of Gordon Moore who most recently died, who was the founder of Intel. And he said, if you're only failing 50% of the time, you're not trying hard enough. And that's what the Silver Giving staff tries to do. We try to fail as often as possible because we learn through it. And I think that's the role of philanthropy, right? Mm-hmm. There are billions and billions and billions of state and local and federal dollars allocated to the K-12, pre-K-12 endeavor. But our job is to be the risk capital in this endeavor, right? The ones who are really working on the margins that can impact the middle.
Yeah.
So that's my little bully pulpit, Laura.
No, I appreciate your comments, and I wouldn't call your agenda boring. I would say that
it's boring that we're not changing.
Yes, yeah, but it's also like it brings some stability and allows the idea and the experiment to really see it through. And because these things do take time, as all of you know. So Sarah, I know Chris Ann and Brian talked a little bit about future things they have coming, so I want to go to you first on this. What's on the horizon for you in this work?
Well, I guess I want to say sort of ditto to Phil. I think Phil made me sort of maybe double down on some of the things that I was thinking about in response to this, because, I think that our workforce, I'll go back to something I said at the beginning, that really that the adults or the workforce, they're a theory of change, right? It's those quality of interactions that have the greatest impact on our young children and indeed the families. And, we're experiencing such shortages. And I will say, Phil, so the governor of Illinois, Governor Pritzker, did announce a Smart Start initiative where he was dramatically increasing many budget areas in multiple early childhood areas, which is terrific. However, if we try to expand that and we don't really invest in the workforce, it's not going to happen. And I will say, Phil, I have pointed to California as evidence as to why we need to invest in the workforce, because, and now I have a specific number that I'll quote of 15,000 teachers shy, that if we don't do that, as you said, as goes California, there goes the other states. And so, I think we really need to do that. As I said, I'm a policy systems thinker, and I think in many ways we don't have sort of the systems and the policy design behind that, because we can give money to providers, but if the providers are underfunded, they might be using that money for other things other than salaries. So we have to really think about the policy design behind that, and really drive that home. And I think there's that using our funder voice, because there's a mindset out there that lies underneath this, that, oh, you're teaching little kids, you're not teaching calculus or Shakespeare, right, or whatever. And so it can't be complicated, it can't be, it doesn't require that much, and we don't need to pay. Wrong, right? Wrong. And we know that, but we have to use our voices to start changing that mindset and advocating for the salaries and the preparation that we know our workforce deserves. So I will echo your workforce call out, and also say, let's use our voices, whether it's letters to the editor, op-eds, communicating with elected officials, because I think philanthropy does need to be the risk taker, and also have the long view. Right? I mean, that's what distinguishes us from our governmental partners, is philanthropy can take risks and take the long view that sometimes our governmental partners cannot. And just the last thing I would say is, I hope we can also move from bright spots to bright systems, and really think about how we the systems can replicate, those bright spots, so that regardless of where a kid ends up, that they're the beneficiary of some of those bright spots. So.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sarah. So I do want to come back to Chris-Ann and Brian on this question about what's on the horizon for anything you want to add. First, to the audience, reminding you that we're about to go to question and answer. So if you have anything bubbling up that you'd like to ask any of the funders, or we're going to bring Swati back to, then go ahead and put those in the Q&A box. So Chris-Ann, let's start with you. If you can just take a minute or so to tell us about what's coming.
Well, we are excited to learn from our cohort of grantees in Colorado. And so we'll be publishing a report on that before the end of the year as those grants wrap up, to really look at that transition between pre-K and K. And we're also, really excited about the Department of Education's initiatives in this area, and want to play a role in helping to strengthen preschool through third grade, and was really excited actually to hear the other day about the new pilot initiative at the Department of Education around funding preschool programs with some Title I dollars. So just excited about that and looking for ways to support that moving forward.
Yes, that program is part of the budget, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, the new budget initiative for this year.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Brian, what's on the horizon for you in Illinois, the McCormick?
Sure, and I think I did cover a decent number of these, but I think to the points that Sarah and Phil raised about the workforce, I think that's an area that we see as an area of focus. We invested recently in a partner here called It Takes a Village Family of Schools that has a early learning program and a charter school, and they've been able to really successfully help bring in people from their community and build sort of a pathway through to the CDA, to the AA, to higher credentials, and we've been supporting their work on the higher end to getting to teacher licensure and addressing that workforce crisis. So I think that this point of as we're growing our number of classrooms and access, we've got to have people to staff those classrooms who are being well compensated, well supported. So I think we're looking for additional opportunities to really address investing in the workforce. Then I would say the other thing is really kind of related to workforce. And we don't yet have a sort of specific investment, but I do think we need to figure out how we sort of change this paradigm of who's entering the leadership pipeline for schools, and really examine, why is it that fewer of our early grades teachers, or it seems like almost none, become principals and choose that pathway? Is it because as a society we value them less, we treat them less as professionals? What's the difference, and how do we change that? How do we really intentionally call in early grades teachers and say, you've got great leadership skills that we need at the building level and at the district level. So I'm hoping for some opportunities to emerge there.
Yeah, thanks for that, Brian. And Swati, I want to invite you back. And before there's a question that I want you to answer, but just a comment on what you just said, Brian. I was at a meeting in Idaho last week, and it's certainly true that principals and superintendents, like whether they have early childhood experience or not, they can become early childhood leaders. But there was a new superintendent at the meeting from a district in Washington who began as a preschool teacher. And she had, her career like steeped in that early learning experience. And, it makes a lot of difference. And we need more of those early grade or even, preschool teachers to take on those education leadership roles to help influence their peers and just be big, strong voices. So Swati, the first question to you about expanding full day kindergarten and whether, the emphasis on kindergarten as a sturdy bridge includes an emphasis on, encouraging the expansion of full day kindergarten. What are your thoughts on that?
It's, the research is really clear on that question. When children have a preschool program, they're going into a half-day kindergarten program. It just isn't enough time to really build that continuity that so many of you have been talking about. And it's that it just takes more time than a half day. And so it's easy to forget that a lot of school districts aren't still, don't necessarily have full day K programming. And so I think I know the Education Commission of the states has a report that they produce, and I'm eagerly awaiting it because that's one of the areas we want to pay attention to. And, there are no silver bullets. It is system building and all these components that everyone has talked about. But it also, that fundamental point of access and quality instruction and time in these settings, and not just, 1 year. But I think a lot of research has shown that 2 years of high quality preschool followed by full day kindergarten is really that continuity needed before first grade. So yes to full day K.
Yeah. Do any of you others want to jump in? I mean, I think this goes to the funding issue that was raised, or are we providing funds for developmentally appropriate kindergarten or early grades? And if in the half day setting, or even places that districts are offering full day kindergarten, they might not be getting funding for full day kindergarten depending on the state. So I open if anyone else wants to jump in on that full day kindergarten question. No, okay. So let's go. We have a little bit of time. There are a few comments coming in about just the workforce. I know that we've talked about the importance of more educators and teacher shortages. We also have a question about, I think, something that I see in some of the comments that are in there is around school readiness. And I know we had a comment earlier about assessments, and there's a lot of assessments to see if the children are ready, but we also need to think about schools being ready for whatever children, for whomever arrives into the classrooms. And so I just I'm wondering, if thinking about your work or future investments, how you're thinking about ensuring that the focus is both on children and families being ready, but also systems, schools, educators being ready to receive children into kindergarten.
I can jump in here, Laura. I had included a link to a report that about a grant initiative that we had done about a year ago. And it really is about sort of, responding to, I think, what Phil was talking about, that in California, especially, that, children are coming into our school systems and programs from really a diverse set of family and cultural backgrounds and contexts. And, educators need to be highly skilled to be able to meet their needs. Children have many different learning differences, disabilities, and certainly we want to be encouraging inclusive classroom environments. So, recognizing this, the Trust for Learning had an initiative a couple of years ago to support, again, a cohort of grantees, because that's typically how we work, through a program that we called Supporting Equitable Educator Development. And it looked at a number of different strategies on ways to support a more inclusive, skilled, and sustainable early educator workforce. Of course, one that would be aligned with those principles of ideal learning that I mentioned. And we did learn, quite a lot about the different ways that different programs and locations, and even in one case, a government entity is trying to do that by supporting different partners in that effort. And you can read about our Supporting Equitable Educator Development program right on our website. I included it and link in the chat, but I just think that everything from providing, we tested out a number of different strategies, everything from providing more educator development post pre-service, to providing different types of coaching initiatives for educators, to developing coaching competencies for educators, to developing online training programs for educators. So there's a lot of, I think, different solutions. I don't think there's just one, and a lot of different strategies that we tested out.
And Laura, I would just add a little bit, going back to the idea of narrative and using our voice. And two things with respect to that. One, in Illinois, our kindergarten readiness was specifically called KIDS, KIDS, which stands for Kindergarten Individual Development Survey, because it was trying to get away from this idea of a high stakes assessment, away from the idea that, people want to think of school starts when you walk in this building and it's K-12. And so we don't want them to think that everything that happens before is not about learning. So I want to remind us, that think very carefully about the language. And I know Christy Coward's put at the National P3 Center, put in the Ready Schools report. And again, really talking about the ready schools and how that's, we need to not assume that the student or the child needs to be changed, but what do we do to make the system and the school learning environment better? And I think that's really important for our voice at this particular point in time.
Great.
And just to build off what Sarah said, I think what's also missing in the policy conversation, to the point that we can't blame the kids, shouldn't blame the teacher, but how do you hold the system accountable and give them the support so they can meet those accountability expectations for, did learning take place? In the state of California, we pretend that kids don't actually exist until they're 8 years old, because the school districts are only held accountable for third grade outcomes, when we know most of the learning takes place before that. So it's this disintermediation where, that's why if you ask any principal today, back to my earlier comment, where does she put her best teachers? She puts them in third grade, because it's the first time that she's held accountable, right? And back to this long-term versus short-term thinking, that's what superintendents are held accountable. So, and I'm not all about testing. I'm not all about putting pencils in 3-year-olds' hands so they can do multiplication tables. But how did you know that learning take place, and what are you going to do when it didn't? Right? Those simple questions where we need to give teachers the tools to be able to do that. And we need to incentivize the system to accomplish that. And currently the system is exactly the opposite of that. We are getting the outcomes the system is designed to get by incentivizing people to do this when we actually need them to do that.
Yeah, I'll just quickly
another bully pulpit.
Yeah.
Would fully agree on that, and I'll just point to a bright system, to use Sarah's term. In Chicago, CPS is rethinking its accountability system to move away from a single summative score, like either your school is good or bad, et cetera, to thinking about the inputs, the outputs, and the outcomes. Does your school have the resources to be successful? What are the needs of the families that you're serving, and then what are the outcomes that you're producing? And so something that we funded alongside some other philanthropic partners here is to really make sure that the early grades, pre-K, second grade are a part of that that way of thinking about schools and the resources schools have and their outcomes. Not, not for high stakes, not to say we're going to start, testing preschoolers, but to say that this is a part of the school environment and this is part of how the school reaches the outcomes it does. So, still emerging work, but I think an opportunity to rethink the system in that aspect.
Yeah. Well, thanks to all of you for the investments that you're making, for the work that you're doing, and for participating today. And Sarah, Torian, back to you.
Thank you so much. I just noticed that we're like 1 minute away. I was so engaged in this conversation. I was just like, oh, wait, we're supposed to close soon. So I just dropped the links to register for upcoming conversations in the chat. So I hope everyone will take a moment and make plans to join us for those future sessions. And maybe we can bring up the slide and show those in a second. But wow, a huge, huge thank you to our amazing panel today. Thank you to Swati Adarkar for joining us again to share highlights of the emerging pre-K3 agenda that's coming out of the Department of Education. Thank you so much again to Laura Bornfriend for joining us to moderate this conversation. And thanks so much to our amazing funder panel for reminding us about the importance of failing, investing in the workforce, systems change, so many incredible insights that you all shared. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much to Chris and Gail for Trust for Learning, to Phil Halperin from Silver Giving Foundation, Sarah Slaughter from Stone Foundation, and Brian Stokes from McCormick Foundation. Really appreciate it. Thank you all again for joining us. Hope you'll join us for future conversations and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks.